Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Matt Grossmann. He is director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research and professor of political science at Michigan State University. And today we're going to talk about his book, Polarized by Degrees: How the Diploma Divide and the Culture War Transformed American Politics. So, Dr. Grossmann, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to everyone.
Thanks for having us.
So let me ask you first, before we get into more detail here, broadly speaking, how would you characterize the divide you explore in your book? What is it really about?
Well, the diploma divide usually refers to the electoral divide between people without college degrees and with college degrees voting for parties of the left and the right. And indeed, across the world, there has been an increase in the divide between college educated and non-college educated voters. But in the US, because we have a two-party system, it's taken an extremely polarized form. And it has transformed each major political party. The divide is very associated with the rise of social and cultural issues in our politics relative to economic issues. So where the discussion is more about society and culture, we see bigger education divides and lower income divides. And so the divide is not just about social groups or status, it's also about the overall direction of society and the rise in social progressivism. And those folks for and against it.
Mm-hmm. So in the book, you go through two major social trends that motivate your analysis, mainly the steady growth of educational experience in the US and also the liberalization of American society since the 1980s. Could you explain each of those trends?
Sure. So I think people, when they hear polarization or big divide, they think things are probably steady. That is, they're calcified. But actually, there's been quite a bit of change. That is, we are much more educated than we were in the past. College graduation, graduate school, every form of educational credentialism is growing. And social and cultural issue opinions in the American public and across our social sectors are moving leftward. That is, we've moved to more liberal positions on issues like race and gender and gay rights. That doesn't mean it's steady and never goes back, but the overall progression over decades has been leftward. So how that manifests in the two political parties is that the Republican Party really, its coalition hasn't changed that much. It's always been predominantly white non-college voters. But the Democratic Party has changed dramatically, where white non-college voters have been replaced as the plurality constituency by white college voters. And the party is getting more diverse. So a really huge change in the coalition of the parties and pretty recent, where, half of Bill Clinton's votes came from white voters without college degrees in the 1990s, and less than a quarter of Joe Biden's votes did in the most recent election. So another way of saying that is all of the change that's occurring in American society, the increased education and the diversification, has been occurring kind of doubling within the Democratic Party and trying to not really occur within the Republican Party.
And how are these two major trends related to one another? Did the liberalization of American society follow the growth of educational experience, the other way around? I mean, what is the relationship here?
They are self-reinforcing trends, but they also both have factors that are causing them independently of the other. So it's really the culmination of both trends that is producing this huge change in American society. But I think one clue that it isn't just kind of happenstance is that it's happening all over the world. That is, across the rich world, we're seeing decreasing divides between the left and right based on income and more increasing divides based on education, and that's occurring where these cultural issues are becoming more dominant and where society is moving leftward at a faster pace. So all of that suggests that there are sort of inherent trends here having to do with modernization of society, secularization, diversification, globalization that are affecting everyone. They just, and causing both of those trends, but they are occurring, they're taking this very different form in the US because we have no like populist anti-immigration party to take the lower educated constituents in on the right, and we have no Green Party or other kind of higher education party to take those folks on the left. So they both transformed the major two parties.
Mm-hmm. And more broadly, apart from these two major trends, what are the factors that play the biggest role in social change, in the changing of social values?
Well, it's a complicated issue, obviously, but there is a old theory in political science that basically once called post-materialism that says once you got basic access to resources and the ability to live your lives, then people started to become concerned about other issues like equality, like environmentalism, and another related trend that's usually talked about is that, you know, there really was a worldwide kind of awakening of social and cultural values in the 1960s in the United States, but that moved across the rich world. We aren't sort of seeking to have like one big explanation of that, just observing that, you know, for a prediction made 40 years ago, it's pretty good, or 50 years ago, it's pretty good indicator of how things have traveled across the rich world. That's not to say that, you know, political actors didn't have a role in this. You can see that because some of these trends were quite delayed, right? So there might have been an increase. There was a, you know, a women's movement and a gay rights movement for a long time, but it still took political actors to make those issues more central to our politics and politics in other parts of the world. So they weren't necessarily inevitable that they would happen at this particular time, but we think there were a lot of forces pushing in the same direction.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of demographics, you mentioned that briefly earlier, but what are the demographics that tend to represent the diploma divide? Is it degree holding white Democrats and degree lacking white Republicans? Is it that?
It's certainly most pronounced among white Americans, but it's starting to occur among Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans, to a lesser degree among Black Americans, because they're just sticking with the Democratic Party at such enormous rates. But it is most concentrated and happened earlier among white Americans. It's also associated with an urban-rural divide. So people who leave rural areas tend to be more likely to get an education, and so it has meant that urban areas have been moving towards the Democrats, and non-urban areas have been moving towards the Republicans. But we are seeing that when you have a chance to kind of see those trends separated, they do separate with education being more important than urbanicity. So we saw that in the last election, where Trump actually made some gains in urban areas, but did not make gains in areas that were full of high education voters. But we simplify it with this college or not, but it also is a wider spectrum. So people with graduate degrees are extremely likely to be on the Democratic side. People with degrees from more elite institutions are more likely to be on the Democratic side. And if you separate the people who have 2-year versus in the middle, some college versus 4 years, then you see that differentiation from the right to the left with the most education. So it's simplified as college or not, but it's really a spectrum of education.
And does the diploma divide also include any racial or ethnic minorities?
So the big trend is that it's concentrated among white voters and happened first among white voters. But one thing that you have to keep in mind is that among all groups, higher education voters used to be more Republican. It wasn't because of high education, it was because education and income are related, and higher income voters used to be more Republican. So among Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans, for example, that used to be true. And now we're seeing the decline of that income divide and the increase in the education divide among non-white voters as well. It just hasn't come as fast or as far as it has among white voters. The big reason because minority voters have continuing attachments to the Democratic Party that move beyond their opinions on social issues.
And what is a culture war? What does that term mean, and how would you characterize the current one?
First, just one thing on the last one, on the last question about minorities that's relevant here is that the issue divides that appear between college degree holders and non-college degree holders among white Americans are also there among all other racial categories. So people with college degrees, whether they be white, Black, Hispanic, Asian American, are more likely to hold liberal positions on social and cultural issues like race, gender, gay rights, drugs, anything along that kind of spectrum. And that's relevant because the culture war issues have become an increasing part of our politics. They are more likely to be mentioned in all kinds of political communications than they have been in the past. The reason that it's usually talked about as a culture war is because it extends beyond politics. That is, we're arguing about lyrics in music, or the role of celebrities, or the latest commercial. Everything becomes a part of this kind of two-sided debate between the left and the right about whether society is changing too fast, undermining traditional values, or whether it's kind of embracing the future. And so yes, it's tied to these specific social cultural issues, and that's why it can have this predominant role in our politics, but it's also wider than that. So almost anything can seem political to people, whether you post on Facebook about a music that you like, or you make a pronouncement at the beginning of your talk in a university. All of those things are going to be perceived as political much more than they have been in the past.
And does either side have an advantage over the other in this culture war?
In terms of the changes in society, the left continually wins. They win slowly in some cases and faster in other cases. But it often appears that they're losing because in any given policy issue at the time, that it is being raised in politics because it's more controversial. So just as an example, for gay rights, we had big changes in public opinion and policy on gay rights, first in anti-discrimination laws, then in gay marriage laws. And now we have a whole set of issues surrounding transgender Americans that had been moving leftward and are now facing a backlash from the right. But what we've seen historically is that the right can kind of cede ground on individual issues like on gay marriage without losing this overall perception that things are moving too fast. And so as an electoral matter, it does not seem to help the Democrats that social values have been moving leftward here, because they're always trying for the next thing, which it might be unpopular at the time.
And how have these developments manifested on the American party system?
Well, it's had a huge effect. It has changed the composition of the Democratic Party in particular, and changed the image of the parties. Since for about 50 years, the most popular thing that people said that they liked about the Democratic Party, if you just ask an open-ended question, what do you like about the Democrats? It was that it's the party of the common man or the party of the working class. That and the most negative thing people said they didn't like about the Republican Party, again, for 40 or 50 years, was that it was the party of big business or the upper class. So these kind of class cleavage in American politics was a big part of how people understood the parties. But because those coalitions are now changing, now the image of the Democratic Party is really tied to its white, highly educated, constituents and the policy issues and priorities that they are pushing. And the view of the Republican Party is less about, a party of the rich and more about a party of those who think that society is changing too fast and should go back to the way it was.
So in terms of their issue agenda specifically, how would you characterize the changes that have occurred between the Democrats and the Republicans?
Well, first, I do want to say that most American policymaking at the national and state level is still about economics and budgets. And so part of what's happening here is we're having campaigns that are more about social issues, and then we have to go back to governing. And governing is not necessarily about those things that the campaign was about. But you can see the parties are trying their best to make it about those things. So even what's happening now in the Trump administration, it's sort of being pursued as economic policy, as about the budgets of particular agencies or, stopping particular grants. But it's really all motivated by this sort of war on wokeness, this idea that cultural liberalism has taken over in government and society. One reason why it kind of is a failed policy agenda is because if you think about what they're actually trying to change, it's much wider than government, right? Yes, they're mad about, say, transgender participation in in sports, but they're really mad that there's an increasing number of people who are identifying as transgender, and that's just much more difficult to stop than, say, change a particular policy. On the other side, the Democratic Party has become increasingly interested in social and cultural issues that manifests in including them in all kinds of economic policies. So you had a policy on building factories, for example, that now required particular gender standards, particular environmental standards. All of those issues got moved into economic issues. And then also the priorities changed. I mean, the two biggest policy changes of the Biden administration were really the Inflation Reduction Act about climate change, and then the student loan forgiveness, which are priorities of the educated compared to previous Democratic administrations.
So to illustrate this divide, could you tell us about the contrast between two major political figures, namely Barack Obama and the message of hope and change, and Donald Trump and the message of Make America Great Again, or MAGA?
Yeah, that really encapsulates kind of how the parties are now viewing themselves and how they're viewed by outsiders. Barack Obama was obviously himself a manifestation of change. He was the first Black president. He was also a constitutional law professor who talked like the educated. And Donald Trump has a message of bringing things back to the way they were, stopping the extreme changes in society that he is seeing, and talking in the more simple ways of consumer marketing and pop culture in ways that appeal to less educated constituents. So both those slogans and the sort of manifestations point to this divide. Now, one thing that we should say is that this is unlike divides on, say, race and gender, where the mass parties are divided and so are the elected officials. In terms of education, what we have is the mass divide based on college education, but then the entire political class basically having college educations and often graduate education. So 95% of members of Congress have college degrees, 70% have graduate degrees. And so you have these figures like Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, who are saying that they are representative of this new constituency, even though they themselves went to Ivy League institutions and are sort of portraying themselves as kind of traitors to their class to represent people without college degrees.
So these trends that we've been talking about in regards to social change and how it manifests at the level of politics, are they things that we also see occurring in other countries, or are they mostly or particularly an American phenomenon?
Certainly, all across the rich world, we're seeing an increase in the role of social and cultural issues in politics, and an increase in the education divide between the left and the right, and a corresponding decrease in the income divide between the left and the right. But we are the strictest two-party system in the rich world. So what that means is that you can have all kinds of different coalition formations in other countries, and you can have minor parties who kind of lead the way when it comes to these kinds of differences. So you can have really populist parties who represent the less educated, who can leave the kind of high income constituents to the traditional center-right party, but become the manifestation of these changes. And then similarly on the left, you can have your more traditional union-dominated party of the center-left and have rising constituents that represent the more highly educated in places like green parties. And so what that means is that the traditional parties don't change as much, but they lose share. So most of what's happening in other parts of the world as a result of this is that we have a decreasing share for the traditional major parties. In the US, we're stuck with the same two parties, and they've just become different internal coalitions.
So some social scientists and political scientists have been pointing to this phenomenon that they say is occurring more or less across the entire globe, of young women moving to the left progressively and young men also progressively moving to the right, so to the other end of the political spectrum. Is this something that we also see occurring in the US? And if so, does it have any relationship at all with the divide we're talking about here or not?
It certainly has a relationship in two ways. Number one is that the higher education system has become increasingly dominated by women. In fact, it's more geared toward women now than it was geared toward men before Title IX was passed in the 1970s. So it's been a big transformation of the higher education sector. And the gender divide is related to the cultural issue divide. So women have more liberal or left positions on cultural issues than men. And so the more that politics becomes about social and cultural issues, the more that you see a gender divide across the world. Two other things I would quickly say about that, though, are that I think are sometimes misunderstood, is that first of all, young people are just more likely to reflect the politics of the time. So that means that you don't have a firm partisanship when you first start voting, and so that means that you kind of reflect the trends of the time. So in the 2008 election, young people were assumed to be extremely democratic. This election, they were assumed to be moving rightward, but part of that is just they're the people who can move because they don't have the sort of absolutely stable partisanship. And then the other caveat, I guess I would say, is rather than saying they're moving left and right, I think I would just say that men and women have different positions on social and cultural issues. And so to the extent that those issues become more important, you see a bigger divide. There's not as much evidence, for example, that young men are actually moving rightward on issues like gay rights and drugs and things like that, as that men and women differed on those issues, always differed on those issues. But now that politics is about them, there's a bigger gender divide.
And how have the electoral and geographic bases of support of both the Democrats and the Republicans changed with the rise of the diploma divide?
Well, they have changed a lot because college-educated voters are concentrated geographically, and so obviously that means that Democrats, increasingly represent a smaller footprint of the U.S., and that means they can be disadvantaged by kind of generic lines drawn on a map, like states or like districts that aren't specifically drawn to try to equalize partisanship. It also, we should point out that this education divide is not only an individual divide, it's also a cultural divide. And that means that if you live in an area that is surrounded by college graduates, you are more likely to be both on the left and moving left. And if you live in an area that is, whether or not you have a college degree, and similarly, even if you have a college degree, but you are surrounded by people who don't have a college degree, you're also more likely to be on the right and moving rightward. So if you're, say, someone with a graduate degree who lives in a college town, then you're kind of at the extreme end of this, and vice versa. So that means that you're seeing these increasing geographic polarization as a result.
And has it manifested, or have these changes manifested in particular ways in terms of the results of elections?
Yeah, so certainly elections more reflect this divide and decreasingly reflect the divide in income that used to govern election results. They have mattered for things like fundraising and primary turnout and special election turnout as well, because education is a very strong correlate of political participation, voting, donating, calling your member of Congress, everything that you can think of. So by moving the most educated section of the electorate from the Republicans to the Democrats, that means the Democrats have had access to more money, but also more activity and more likely participation in traditionally low turnout elections. So it really has changed kind of the circumstances of the parties. It also matters for things like the Electoral College because it means that these states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, which have lots of white, low education voters, are likely to remain battlegrounds compared to some other places, and some other places that seemed like they were out of reach for Democrats, like Georgia and North Carolina, might become increasing battlegrounds.
So I would like to ask you now a little bit about people's attitudes, or how the divide manifests in terms of people's attitudes toward educators, journalists, scientists, and institutions like universities, and even experts in general. So could you start by telling us about the hostility of Republicans toward experts and institutions like universities and so on?
Yeah, so as you might imagine, people who've gone through higher education are going to be more positive about both educational institutions and the role of expertise in society. But we also, because we have this big divide between the parties, we've had increasing discussion between the parties about these institutions, with Republicans believing they're biased toward liberals. In part because they are, largely and increasingly composed of people who are liberal on social and cultural issues and do identify as Democrats. So this obviously blew up in the COVID epidemic, in which Republicans started to really be skeptical of claims of expertise because they were associated with impositions of big changes in people's everyday lives. And Republicans perceived that some of these impositions were guided by political principles rather than by expertise. Now, there's no divide if you ask people about the principles of science or about the whether we should try to learn more, or sort of this basics. It's really about the scientists themselves and the institutions that they're in, like universities and government, that have generated this skepticism on the right. But it isn't just hollow language. We're seeing it now in the administration, where there's really no respect for people who have been working in particular issue areas over a long period on public policy, or people from the outside who are grantees or contractors who come from this sector, because Republicans believe that they have been guided by their political principles. And not without cause. There really has been a change in how these institutions talk about issues like race and gender. And Republicans have noticed, but kind of expanded their critique to the institutions as a whole.
And on the other hand, talking about the Democrats, what kinds of attitudes do they have toward experts and institutions like universities?
They're much more favorable, and in the COVID epidemic, they became much more favorable. We don't know how much of that will be retained, but this really would be surprising to 1960s activists who did not think that Harvard University and the New York Times were the heroes of moving America in a leftward direction. But now a lot of Democrats see these institutions as bulwarks and as institutions that should continue their role in American politics and society, and it's Republicans who want to burn them all down, which is quite a contrast.
Have there also been changes in terms of the content produced by conservative media on institutions like universities and the educational system more generally?
Yeah, and we went through this with regard to the media earlier. So it again might surprise people, but trust in the media used to be higher among Republicans in the 1960s and 70s because Republicans were higher income and they were more likely to read a daily newspaper and all of that. And it really took this very long movement among the conservatives to say these institutions are liberally biased and we should build alternative institutions. And among the things talked about, for example, one study of Rush Limbaugh's radio program in the 1990s said that he talked about Democrats that he didn't like every day, and he talked about the bias in the media every single day. So that was the kind of core message of conservative media. And it has now become a core message about universities, about experts, about the higher education voters, and about cultural liberals guiding institutions, even in business and in the nonprofit community. And that's an expansion of this same kind of rhetoric. And among universities, it's useful to kind of look at its progression. It was always the case that conservatives were skeptical of people in, ethnic studies departments and political correctness on campus, but you saw that it expanded in kind of debates over religion and over environmentalism to not just be about humanities scholars or social scientists, but now about natural scientists as well. And those institutions similarly became more invested in what the right would see as a political project over time. And so that's created our current big divide.
But when it comes to these hostile attitudes toward some institutions like universities, have they had actual effects on the targeted institutions? Are they, for example, more vulnerable in any way now?
Certainly, we're seeing right now the major threats to university funding from the federal government and from state governments, efforts to try to control things like faculty hiring, curriculum from state governments, and as provisions in federal funding. So all of that is a big change from, even a few years ago when higher education was mostly a state political issue. And it was mostly about, what can we do to support our states, universities versus other states. And there were concerns, but they were more about access, about matching the university curriculum with the job market, things like that, rather than this kind of war on wokeness, which has become the most central part of higher education politics now.
So we've talked about the media, about universities, experts. How about corporations? Has there been any impact on corporations, how they are run, their values, and how Republicans and Democrats relate to them and their leadership?
Absolutely. So because people who have higher education have more socially and culturally liberal values and dominate all social institutions, that means that they have brought those values to those institutions. And they became pretty open about it in the wake of George Floyd and some other, and the first Trump administration. And that meant that conservatives really noticed and were alarmed about the trends in their kind of traditional partner in corporate America. So there was a real change, and there is a huge backlash, and that has kind of ignited a big shift in corporate politics. What we're seeing now is companies trying to react to the backlash. Some of that is real. Some of that is just changing the names. Some of it is just scaling back initiatives that might have been seen as temporary before. But there's been big change in corporate policies and in the Republican approach to companies as a result of this. We would just emphasize that this isn't necessarily the Marxist project that some conservatives imagine, that people came in and took over these institutions. It's mostly companies responding to their employees, companies responding to their customers, and trying to follow social trends. And that's meant that they've been caught up in these same trends, same social and cultural trends moving leftward that the Democratic Party has been, and they're facing a backlash as a result.
So I would like to ask you now about how this divide has manifested in terms of policy making. And with that in mind, let's explore the example of the COVID-19 pandemic. So how did the divide manifest during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, it was front and center because a lot of policymaking became the domain of experts. Americans saw these people that they had never heard of before guiding American policy, and pretty drastic changes in everyday life. Figures like Anthony Fauci, who people had never heard of, became they became quickly a 50-point difference in Americans' attitudes toward this guy as a result of the COVID wars. And it has had permanent effects. It has meant that Republicans are more skeptical about the role of experts, about the role of government officials, about the role of public health, all kinds of pieces. And we would point out that, of course, there are always going to be examples of overreach or policies that went too far, or policies that might have been aligned toward political values as opposed to expertise. So, for example, one salient example that usually comes up is that public health officials endorsed protests against George Floyd right after they had opposed protests against the lockdowns and told everyone that, it was dangerous to congregate in large areas. And conservatives, I think, rightly saw that as motivated by a set of social and political values. So expertise is always going to be a combination of greater knowledge, but also distinct, but not necessarily better values. And it is, and of course, interests. That is the role of these people having a bigger impact in society. And so experts are always going to want kind of more impact. They are going to be affiliated with the evidence, but they also have distinct values. And so that means that their pronouncements are just increasingly politicized today.
So what does it mean to say that everything is about politics and politics is about everything?
Well, when our politics becomes about social and cultural issues, and when people's complaints about who they're seeing on television or what kind of straws they're encountering in restaurants, or every single daily thing can be associated back to some kind of political issue, it really just means that it's hard to stay out of politics. It also matters for these institutions that believe that they're kind of not on one side of the culture war, but are increasingly placed on one side. So it's very hard to be an institution that is above the fray if you're, say, a technology company, or you're a nonprofit organization, a service provider who wants to say we're not on either side of the culture war. They really are increasingly on one side, because every kind of pronouncement or thing that they do is going to be perceived as having that clear political valence. And so it's very hard then to get out of that. That is, there's a bunch of self-reinforcing cycles here where you can't sort of say, we're going to step back without that being perceived as a political move as well.
One last question then. How do you look at the future of this divide? Do you think that it is something that could be bridged in any way? And do you approach it as a problem that we could and should try to solve? Or are you simply exploring a social and political phenomenon here?
We're admittedly light on solutions, maybe because they aren't readily apparent. But yes, there's a lot of self-reinforcing processes here. They have some detrimental effects, especially if we talk about how we see one another and our ability to communicate across that divide and actually get a policy done. I think sometimes this is overstated. That is, like I said, a lot of governing is still about economic policy and budgets. There's a lot more bipartisanship than people think because they hear about the partisan fights, but not the things that do get resolved. And so in terms of policymaking, there still can be progress, but it tends to get less attention. But there are a lot of reasons why this is likely to continue into the future. And all the things that people want to do to reform the system are also pieces of the culture war. So, you could say, well, this means we have to reform our institutions to do X, Y, and Z, but that is going to be perceived as being on one side of the social and cultural conflict that we're having in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Great. So the book is again Polarized by Degrees, How the Diploma Divide and the Culture War Transformed American Politics. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Grossmann, just before we go, apart from the book, where can people find you and your work on the internet?
My website is mattg.org, and I'm on all of the social media platforms as well if people want to follow current thoughts. And I have my own podcast called The Science of Politics, where I interview political science researchers. So hopefully people will check that out as well.
Great. I'm also leaving links to that in the description of the interview. And Dr. Grossmann, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks. Great to talk with you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigor N, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley's, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Jos Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.